A woman is dragged naked through frozen cobblestone streets on a January morning in 1342 Troyes, France, while her own children throw stones at her face. Her crime, a whispered rumor. No trial, no evidence, just an accusation that turned her neighbors into executioners in the bitter winter cold. But that was just the beginning. What came next was so disturbing that even the priest performing the ritual vomited into the frozen snow. Her name is lost to history, but the court record survives. Woman lost her right eye when struck by sharpened bone thrown from crowd. Punishment continued as prescribed by law. This isn't fiction. This happened thousands of times across medieval Europe during the brutal winter months when punishment became spectacle, when cold became weapon, when the systematic destruction of women's bodies was considered God's work. And the methods they used were so psychologically devastating that modern torture experts still study them today. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you the real documents, the actual laws like King Tut's explicit commands, the horrifying testimonies from women like Gertrude of Germany, whose children watched her mutilation, the account books showing executioners were paid 3 shillings per nose, 2 shillings per ear. And here's what will really disturb you. The people who designed these punishments weren't sadistic monsters. They were respected community leaders, priests, and lawmakers who believed they were doing God's work during those long, frozen winter months when villages turned inward and terror kept women obedient. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand why one historian called this the most systematic destruction of the female body in European history. And fair warning, some of what you're about to hear crosses lines you didn't know existed. Before we dive into specific punishments, you need to understand something crucial. This wasn't chaos. This was a system, a carefully designed machine of terror that operated across centuries, from frost-covered Norwegian villages to February squares in Barcelona. In medieval Europe, a woman's body was never truly hers. The moment she married, she became what legal scholars called femme covert, a covered woman covered by her husband's identity, his property. And like any property damage to a femme covert was a crime against the owner, not against her. An adulteress wasn't just breaking a marriage vow. She was committing theft, counterfeiting heirs, destroying a man's most valuable asset, his certainty about his bloodline. Think about the economics. In a world without DNA tests, without birth certificates, the only way a man could be sure his children were actually his was through absolute sexual control of his wife. Her infidelity didn't just wound his pride, it threatened to redirect his entire fortune to another man's bloodline, could destroy alliances between families, could invalidate treaties between kingdoms. So the response had to be proportional to the perceived threat. And that's where it gets dark, because these punishments weren't designed just to hurt one woman. They were designed to terrify thousands, to create such vivid, scarring spectacles that every woman in every village would carry the images in her mind like a brand. The cruelty was the point. The horror was the message. And winter made it worse. Let's start with the punishment considered merciful, the carting or penance walk. Those gentle terms hide something far more sinister: psychological warfare disguised as justice. Imagine you're a woman in 14th century Augsburg, Germany during the frozen January of 1487. Before dawn, the bailiff and his men break into your home. They don't arrest you quietly. They make sure your children watch as they drag you through winter darkness to the town square, where a rough wooden stool has been set up, frost covering its surface. A barber, sometimes the same man who shaved your husband for years, approaches with shears in the freezing morning air. Historical records from Augsburg describe how they would deliberately make the shaving as ugly as possible. They'd leave patches, cut the scalp until blood froze on skin, make the woman look not just shaved but diseased, monstrous. One account from 1487 describes a woman who begged them to at least make it even. The crowd laughed, their breath fogging in the January cold. Her humiliation was their entertainment, but the shaving served a deeper purpose. In medieval symbolism, a woman's hair was her crown, her beauty, her feminine identity. To shave it in the frozen square was to unmake her as a woman, to strip away not just her hair, but her social identity, while winter cold made the blade cut deeper, made bleeding harder to stop. Then came the stripping. In some regions, they'd leave her in a thin shift. In others, particularly England and parts of France, the law explicitly required complete nudity. Why? Because female nudity in public wasn't just shameful, it was spiritually contaminating. It transformed her into a walking curse, something that polluted the very air around her. And winter made this exponentially worse. Exposure to January cold wasn't just humiliation, it was potential death sentence. Hypothermia could kill within hours. But that was part of the design. She's not just paraded through any streets. She's marched past her own house, past the church, where she was married, past the market, where she bought food, past homes of people she'd known since childhood. And at each stop in the frozen morning, the crowd grows. Town records from multiple cities show that citizens could be fined for refusing to witness these processions. Your neighbors, your friends, people you'd shared meals with, they were legally compelled to be there in the bitter cold, and many went further than mere witnessing. Court documents describe how crowds would throw not just rotten vegetables, but stones, mud mixed with human waste, dead animals. That record from Troyes in 1342, a woman lost an eye when someone threw a sharpened bone. The authorities didn't intervene. This was working as intended. The procession could last hours. In larger cities, they'd take the longest possible route, sometimes parading the woman for 6 or 7 hours in the freezing February weather. Some women collapsed from hypothermia before the route was complete. Some lost their minds right there in the frozen streets, screaming incoherently, which only added to the spectacle. A woman who underwent this ritual during winter faced not just humiliation, but genuine risk of death from exposure. Frostbite could claim fingers, toes, ears. The cold made every thrown stone hurt more because tissue was already numb and brittle. And when she was finally released at her own doorstep in the frozen evening, she'd often find her husband had locked her out, her children, told not to speak to her, her possessions piled in the snow. But the punishment didn't end there. A woman who underwent this ritual was marked for life. She couldn't remarry, couldn't get work, couldn't worship in church without sitting in a special section. One chronicle from Paris describes a woman who 15 years after her penance walk was still recognized on the street and spat upon. This was social death by design, and it was considered the lenient option. Because when an accusation lacked proof, the system had something far worse: trial by ordeal. Even the name sounds medieval and barbaric. But here's what you need to understand: to medieval Europeans, this wasn't barbarism. This was the ultimate form of justice. They genuinely believed God would intervene to save the innocent and condemn the guilty. The most common ordeal for accused adulteresses was trial by cold water in winter made it deadlier. The water used wasn't just any water. It was blessed by a priest, sometimes taken directly from the baptismal font. The reasoning, since water was used in baptism to wash away sin, it would naturally reject a sinner. Pure water would not accept impure flesh. Here's how it worked based on detailed records from dozens of trials across England, France, and Germany during winter months when ice had to be broken first. The woman would be brought to a river or pond at dawn, usually in January or February when water temperature was near freezing, around 4 degrees Celsius. The entire village would be required to attend in the bitter cold. A priest would perform an elaborate ceremony blessing the water, calling upon God to reveal his judgment, while everyone's breath fogged in the frozen air. The woman would be stripped to her shift. Then this is explicitly documented in legal codes like the Saxon Spiegel. She would be bound in a specific way, right thumb to left big toe, left thumb to right big toe, curling her body into a position that made swimming impossible. She'd be thrown into the winter water or forced to jump herself while the crowd watched. Now here's the horrifying physics. January water at 24 degrees Celsius triggers cold shock response, gasping reflex, hyperventilation, rapid heart rate.